The courtroom was quiet as Maya Johnson stood before Judge Martin Miller. It wasn't the kind of case that would make headlines. It was a small, almost trivial matter, something that most people would have brushed off as a simple mistake. Maya had received a fine for an expired vehicle registration. No one in the room expected this to be anything other than a quick formality, another minor case filed away with little fanfare. The judge had seen hundreds of these cases before, and he was already preparing his usual response. A fine, a few words about responsibility, and a quick dismissal. Maya stood tall, her posture dignified, and her expression calm. She was dressed in simple but professional attire, her dark hair neatly tied back in a low bun. There was nothing in her appearance that would suggest she was anything other than an ordinary citizen. To Judge Miller, she looked like someone who had simply made a mistake, someone who would pay the fine and move on. As he looked at her, he could already predict how this case would play out. "Ms. Johnson, it appears you've neglected to renew your vehicle registration," the judge said, glancing down at the paperwork. "This happens to the best of us. But the law is the law. You've been cited, and the fine is $75. Is there anything you'd like to add?" Maya's voice was steady as she responded, but there was an undercurrent of something more, a sense that she wasn't just here for a routine hearing. "Your Honor," she began, "I understand the fine, and I do intend to pay it. However, I would like to clarify that there was an issue with the online registration system. It was down for several days when I tried to renew, and I was unable to complete the process." Judge Miller raised an eyebrow. "I see. But according to the records, this was due weeks ago. Why didn't you take care of it sooner?" Maya's calm demeanor never wavered. "I did try, Your Honor. The system was unavailable. I'm sure you can understand that sometimes these technical issues are beyond a person's control." The judge frowned, not convinced by her explanation. He wasn't used to hearing such responses from people in his courtroom. They usually gave up quickly or offered excuses. But Maya's voice remained firm, her eyes steady as she explained the situation further. As the judge continued to look over the case file, something about Maya's professionalism caught his attention. Her case was clean. No other fines, no history of trouble. The paperwork seemed perfectly in order. He shifted in his chair, sensing that there was more to her than just a woman who had forgotten a deadline. Her demeanor, her composed responses. It was almost as if she was used to being in control, as if she had handled much larger matters than this before. But what struck him the most was the name on the paperwork, Maya Johnson. It rang a faint bell. And for a moment, Judge Miller paused, wondering why the name seemed so familiar. As Judge Miller sat back in his chair, he absent-mindedly flipped through Maya Johnson's case file. The name echoed in his mind, and despite the quiet murmur of the courtroom, he found himself lost in thought for a moment. There was something about that name, something that tugged at the back of his memory. As the silence stretched on, he leaned forward, scanning the details of her records more closely. It didn't take long for him to find what had been eluding him. Hidden among the routine information, her address, phone number, the infraction details, was a section that immediately caught his attention. Maya Johnson wasn't just another driver who had missed a deadline. She was an accomplished professional with a remarkable background. The judge's eyes widened as he read further. Maya wasn't just an engineer. She was a leader in the transportation industry. Her work was directly tied to major federal projects aimed at reshaping the country's infrastructure. She had been involved in initiatives to modernize public transit systems, working closely with the Department of Transportation on multiple high-profile projects. She had developed eco-friendly transportation technologies and was an advocate for increasing accessibility in urban areas. Maya's name had appeared in articles, press releases, and industry reports he had skimmed through, but he had never connected the dots. Judge Miller felt a wave of disbelief. How had someone so influential ended up in his courtroom for something as minor as an expired vehicle registration? He couldn't help but feel a touch of embarrassment. Here he was, ready to issue a fine for a mistake that seemed, in light of her work, incredibly trivial. It wasn't just the fine that bothered him now, but the stark contrast between the importance of Maya's contributions to the public good and the trivial nature of the case he was hearing. He glanced at Maya again, this time with a new sense of respect. She still stood there, her posture relaxed, her face unreadable. She was exactly the kind of person who could walk into a room and quietly command respect without raising her voice. There was nothing brash about her, nothing that screamed high achiever. And yet, as the judge looked at her again, he couldn't ignore the aura of authority that surrounded her. Maya seemed completely unfazed by the proceedings, a far cry from the usual defendants who would squirm or offer apologies at the first sign of trouble. Her composure was both admirable and perplexing. This wasn't the reaction he'd expected from someone who was caught up in such a minor legal issue. Judge Miller cleared his throat and looked up from the file. "Ms. Johnson," he began, his voice softer than before, "I must admit, I didn't realize the extent of your work in the transportation field. I'm truly impressed by the scope of your contributions." Maya simply nodded, acknowledging his words without comment. She wasn't here for praise. She was here to resolve a small issue, a momentary distraction from her larger goals. But as the judge processed the unexpected revelation, he felt a shift in his perception. The case was no longer just about a forgotten deadline. Maya Johnson was someone whose work would affect the lives of millions, and Judge Miller had just become aware of the fact that the woman before him was far more than a driver caught in a small legal snafu. As the judge continued to read through the file, something unexpected happened. The weight of Maya's professional history began to settle on him like a heavy realization. He had entered this case assuming he would deal with a simple legal matter, a routine transaction. But with every line of her background, it became clear that he was in the presence of someone who was, quite literally, changing the future of transportation. Her work was not just important, it was revolutionary. Maya had been a key player in some of the most ambitious transportation projects the country had ever seen. From spearheading green transit initiatives to advancing autonomous vehicle technologies, her ideas were transforming public infrastructure. She was deeply involved with federal agencies, consulting on policies that would not only improve the nation's transport systems, but also address critical environmental concerns. In fact, her work on a groundbreaking initiative for cleaner, faster, and more accessible public transportation had been featured in several national publications over the last year. Judge Miller couldn't help but feel a growing sense of awe as he processed the magnitude of her accomplishments. His previous assumptions about her, based solely on her calm demeanor and the casual nature of her case, were far from the reality of her life's work. How had he never connected the dots before? In the years he'd spent on the bench, he had seen names like hers in the news, in articles detailing cutting-edge projects, but he never imagined they belonged to someone sitting quietly in his courtroom. He glanced up at Maya again. Her presence in the room seemed to shift, her role now taking on an almost surreal quality. She wasn't just another citizen. She was someone whose ideas could influence policy, shape the future of urban living, and perhaps even change the way millions of Americans traveled daily. And yet here she was, dealing with something so small and ordinary, a case he could have resolved with a simple click of his gavel. Maya must have sensed his internal shift, but she said nothing. She didn't seem at all concerned with the grandeur of her career or the judge's newfound understanding of her importance. She was here for one thing: to resolve the matter at hand, no more, no less. And that, in itself, was part of her grace, her ability to focus on what needed to be done without letting accolades or attention distract her. Judge Miller cleared his throat again, feeling the weight of the moment. "I must admit," he said, still looking at the file, "I didn't realize the extent of your impact on the industry. This is extraordinary work." Maya gave a brief nod, but offered no further response. She wasn't there to talk about her projects or explain herself. In a way, it made the judge even more intrigued. Who was this woman, he wondered, who could quietly change the world while remaining so grounded? The judge's thoughts began to churn, torn between his duty as a judge and his newfound respect for the woman standing before him. He had assumed this was a simple case, but now his role in this moment felt much larger, and he knew it was time to reconsider his approach. As Judge Miller sat in silence, pondering Maya's case and the revelations about her professional life, he felt a shift within himself. He'd always prided himself on being impartial, seeing beyond the surface of every case that came before him. But in this moment, he realized how easy it had been for him to slip into the trap of assumptions. He had judged Maya based on nothing more than her appearance, her simple presence in his courtroom. The judge shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his mind racing. He had worked in the legal system for over 2 decades, and never once had he questioned the automatic biases that often clouded his judgment. Today, Maya had shown him that there was so much more to a person than their outward appearance. It wasn't just her calm demeanor that had impressed him. It was the quiet strength in her that seemed to transcend the ordinary. He thought back to her calm, collected responses when he questioned her about the fine. She had spoken with purpose, but also with an assurance that suggested she was accustomed to handling much more significant matters than a trivial legal dispute. The judge felt an uncomfortable tightening in his chest. His initial irritation, which had been provoked by her confident responses, was quickly replaced with an uncomfortable realization. He had been dismissive, assuming Maya was just another person caught up in a minor legal infraction, without considering the possibility that she was someone who had the power to shape the world. His thoughts swirled, and he found himself questioning the systems in which he had always worked, systems that had made it so easy to overlook someone like Maya, despite her remarkable achievements. A wave of guilt washed over him. Maya had done nothing wrong, nothing that would justify this courtroom encounter beyond the simple mistake of an expired registration. And yet, she was here, subjected to a legal process that, under normal circumstances, would not have even crossed her path. The thought struck him that if he had been anyone else, if he had been less engaged or more caught up in the routines of the court, he might never have taken the time to truly see her. What if this moment, this small encounter, could have passed unnoticed? What if he had simply handed down the fine and never realized the depth of her impact on the nation? Judge Miller's internal debate continued as he glanced at Maya once more. Her quiet confidence seemed to fill the room. It was in stark contrast to the typical drama of the cases he handled, which often involved people trying to argue their way out of responsibility. But Maya wasn't here to argue. She was here to take care of something she had no control over, a technical issue with a government system. That's all this was to her. But to him, it was a moment of reckoning. Maya had unknowingly made him face the limitations of his worldview. It was no longer just about the fine. It was about acknowledging the complexity and significance of the people who passed through his courtroom. It was about recognizing that everyone, regardless of their appearance or the nature of their legal issue, brought with them a story far bigger than the moment at hand. Taking a deep breath, Judge Miller made a decision. He would no longer approach this case in the usual manner. Maya Johnson deserved something more than a mere fine. She deserved respect, both for her achievements and for her humanity. The air in the courtroom seemed to grow heavier as Judge Miller mulled over the case in front of him. The wheels in his mind turned slowly, and for a moment, the routine of his work felt distant, almost irrelevant. The usual rhythm of issuing fines and moving on had become a background hum, while the present moment pressed forward with unexpected weight. As Maya stood silently before him, the judge's thoughts swirled between his responsibility as a public servant and his growing awareness of the woman before him. A small voice inside his head reminded him of his duty. It's just a minor fine, nothing more. But then another voice rose, one filled with clarity. She deserves more than this. She deserves recognition, whether it's for this small thing or for everything she's done to impact the nation. He looked at her again, trying to read her, but there was little to interpret. Maya's expression was calm, her composure almost serene, as though she were not waiting for the judge to act, but for him to truly see her. In a way, it felt like she had already resolved this moment in her mind, her only concern now to resolve the technicality of the registration issue. For a moment, Judge Miller's gaze lingered on the file, as if hoping the paperwork would provide him with a simple solution. He imagined the reaction he would normally get from a defendant: embarrassment, quick apologies, and eager willingness to pay the fine. But this was different. Maya was not here to apologize for an oversight. She wasn't here to beg for leniency. She was simply here to fix a minor inconvenience, something that had been beyond her control in the first place. His thoughts turned back to the bigger picture: what she was doing with her life, how her work was already shaping the future of public transportation in ways that most people would never even realize. How many lives had been touched by her innovations? How many cities were already benefiting from her contributions? How many years of work had gone into the kinds of policies and systems she had helped develop? Judge Miller felt a growing discomfort. He wasn't sure if it was because of the humility with which Maya carried herself or the dawning realization of how much he had underestimated her. But he could no longer proceed with this case in the same manner. Maya deserved more than just a fine for something so trivial. This was a moment to pause, to reflect, and to make sure that this small interaction didn't go unnoticed. Clearing his throat, he stood up, catching Maya off guard for a brief moment. The room grew quiet as the judge addressed her directly. "Ms. Johnson," he began, his voice steady but filled with an unexpected sincerity. "I've had the chance to review your case and learn a little more about you, and I must say, I'm truly impressed by the work you've done, not just in transportation, but in advancing solutions that will impact this country for years to come." Maya's expression remained calm, but a faint flicker of surprise passed through her eyes. She hadn't expected this. For a moment, it was clear that the recognition was as unexpected as it was appreciated. "I don't believe this fine is the right way to resolve this matter," Judge Miller continued. "In fact, I'm going to dismiss the case entirely. There's no need for this. You've done far more for this country than this courtroom could ever reflect." The words hung in the air for a moment before Maya responded with a simple nod of gratitude. It wasn't about the fine anymore. It was about acknowledging something much deeper: the importance of her contributions, her quiet yet profound role in shaping the future, and the realization that sometimes the most important moments in life occur in the least expected places. As the judge concluded the session and Maya left the courtroom, it was clear that both had experienced a transformation, one that would linger far beyond the confines of a courthouse. The news of the courtroom incident spread like wildfire, far beyond the small courthouse where it had started. What had initially seemed like a simple case of an expired registration had transformed into a story that captivated the nation. Media outlets, social platforms, and local news stations all picked up the story. But the angle wasn't about the fine, nor about the simple technical glitch that had led Maya to the courtroom. Instead, the story highlighted the unexpected moment when a judge had paused and reconsidered his actions, offering both Maya and the public a powerful lesson in recognition and respect. Within hours, interviews with Maya began to flood the media. News anchors, eager to know how someone of her stature ended up in such an ordinary courtroom situation, invited her to speak on national talk shows. Though she had never sought the limelight, Maya found herself thrust into it, her phone buzzing with messages from friends, colleagues, and even strangers congratulating her for both her accomplishments and her grace under the spotlight. At first, Maya felt uncomfortable with the attention. She was someone who preferred to keep her work behind the scenes, designing transportation systems, advocating for better infrastructure, and quietly making strides in the federal space to ensure a sustainable future for the nation's transit systems. Her work spoke for itself. She never intended for her name to be broadcast across televisions or to have millions of people suddenly aware of her contributions. But the more interviews she did, the more she realized that her story had the potential to inspire others. During one such interview, a host asked, "What does it feel like to be recognized for something as impactful as your work in transportation?" Maya took a breath before answering, her voice steady, but filled with a quiet passion. I've always believed that change happens in the most unexpected ways, whether it's through designing a new transit route or solving a technical issue in a registration system. Every part of my work matters. I don't think about recognition, but I do think about the future, the kind of world I'm helping to create, one project at a time. Her words resonated deeply with viewers. As the stories of her accomplishments gained more traction, Maya's name began to be mentioned alongside well-known innovators in the transportation and environmental fields. Her work, which had once been confined to policy rooms and engineering labs, was now in the spotlight. She was a woman who was transforming the future of travel and sustainability, breaking barriers in a field that had historically been dominated by men. While the national attention was new to Maya, she couldn't ignore the way it was forcing conversations about race and gender in fields like hers. Her story became more than just a personal journey. It became a symbol for underrepresented groups who had often been overlooked in innovation and policy. But as the media spotlight intensified, Maya remained grounded, always bringing the conversation back to the issues that mattered most: public transportation reform, environmental sustainability, and making sure the advancements she was working on would benefit all communities, not just the privileged few, became her primary focus. And yet, amidst all the praise and newfound attention, she never forgot the courtroom. She knew that a simple traffic issue, handled with respect and understanding, had brought her work into the public consciousness. It was a reminder that sometimes it only takes one small, unexpected moment to spark a much larger change. As Maya continued to navigate the new media attention, the buzz around her grew louder. It wasn't just about the courtroom moment anymore. Her name was now synonymous with progress, innovation, and resilience. Maya was no longer a quiet contributor behind the scenes. She was an outspoken leader in transportation reform. Her phone, once silent, now buzzed constantly with requests for interviews, speaking engagements, and invitations to forums where she could discuss the future of public transportation, sustainability, and social equity. Her work, which had been quietly shaping the country's infrastructure, was suddenly in the public eye, and it was clear that people were paying attention. For Maya, the transition from obscurity to recognition was jarring. She had always been content to remain in the background, working with federal agencies, local governments, and engineers to improve transportation systems across the country. She'd never craved the spotlight. But now, with the viral spread of the courtroom story, the spotlight had found her. In one of her first televised interviews, a news anchor asked, "What do you want people to take away from this moment?" Maya smiled, though it was tinged with a hint of exhaustion. "I want people to understand that real change is about more than just big headlines or dramatic moments. It's about everyday work, designing systems that work for everyone, not just a select few. And yes, sometimes it's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in making this world a better place." Her words resonated deeply with viewers, sparking conversations about the nature of innovation, inclusivity, and leadership. Maya's influence began to extend beyond the world of transportation, as she was increasingly sought after for her expertise in creating equitable and sustainable urban spaces. She became an advocate for making cities more walkable, reducing reliance on fossil fuels, and promoting inclusive policies that would make public transit accessible to underserved communities. What Maya didn't expect was how the media spotlight would shine a light on some of the challenges she faced as a woman of color in a traditionally male-dominated field. Though her work had always been respected within industry circles, the newfound attention also brought to light the systemic barriers and biases that had often worked against her. Articles began to highlight her struggles with being one of the few women, and one of even fewer Black women, working at such a high level in transportation policy. In interviews, Maya was asked about the challenges she had faced in her career. "There's a lot of work to be done," she said, "but I'd always believed that if we can challenge the status quo, we can make things better for everyone, not just a few." It was a response that not only resonated with people, but also encouraged other women and minorities to step forward in fields where they had long been underrepresented. As the attention continued to build, Maya felt a shift within herself. No longer was she just working in the background. She was becoming a beacon for change, not only in transportation, but in the larger conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion in industries across the board. The more she shared her story, the more it became clear to her. This was no longer just about one moment in a courtroom or one minor infraction. This was the beginning of something bigger, a movement that could transform not just transportation, but the way we think about innovation and leadership in all areas of society. Months passed, and the media frenzy surrounding Maya Johnson began to calm, but the impact of the story didn't fade. What had started as an ordinary courtroom incident had blossomed into something much larger, a movement that reached far beyond the confines of transportation and policy. Maya had become a symbol of quiet determination, of pushing through barriers and paving the way for those who would come after her. The conversation was no longer just about a judge's decision. It was about the future of transportation, the importance of diversity in leadership, and the crucial role of women in shaping that future. Maya had taken full advantage of the attention, but not for her own gain. She had used her newfound platform to advocate for the changes she had been working on for years, systems that were greener, more sustainable, and most importantly, more accessible to everyone. She partnered with local governments, nonprofits, and educational institutions to push forward policies that would improve public transportation, reduce carbon emissions, and make cities more livable for all residents, particularly marginalized communities. Her efforts began to bear fruit in unexpected ways. Cities started implementing projects based on her recommendations. Transit systems were overhauled to be more efficient, eco-friendly buses were introduced, and policies that ensured better access to transportation for low-income neighborhoods were being considered at the national level. But perhaps the most powerful change Maya experienced was in how she began to see herself. In the quiet moments of reflection, she realized that the world she was working to create was not just a result of her hard work. It was a reflection of all the people she had inspired along the way. Young women of color from around the country, who had previously felt discouraged by the lack of representation in the fields of science, technology, and public policy, now saw Maya as a role model. Her journey from the courtroom to the national stage had given them permission to dream big, to challenge the norms, and to step into leadership roles without waiting for someone else to make space for them. Maya's own journey had come full circle. From a small court case about an expired registration to becoming a national figure, she had unknowingly sparked a movement that would reverberate for generations. She received countless letters from young people, thanking her for showing them that it was possible to make a difference, no matter their background or circumstances. One afternoon, as Maya stood at the front of a conference room filled with policymakers, engineers, and advocates, she reflected on how far she had come. She no longer felt the need to hide behind the scenes or shy away from the spotlight. She had earned her place at the table, not by seeking fame or recognition, but by staying true to her mission. In the end, Maya Johnson's story wasn't about a judge's decision in a courtroom. It was about the lasting impact of one person's work on an entire nation. Her legacy would not only be found in the transit systems she had helped build, but in the minds and hearts of the future leaders she had inspired to follow in her footsteps.